The battlefield stretched beyond the horizon, a graveyard of burning starships and drifting debris. Lieutenant Commander Adrian Kane gritted his teeth as his fighter weaved through the chaos, dodging plasma fire from the enemy fleet. The Arvex Dominion had been relentless in their invasion, but humanity was just as stubborn. The war had raged for years, neither side willing to back down. But amidst the destruction, there was one reason Adrian kept fighting, a reason he could never speak of. Across the battlefield, in the cockpit of an Arvex warship, Captain Soraya Van of the Dominion's elite forces locked eyes with him through her targeting screen. For a split second, her taloned fingers hesitated over the fire control. She should have shot him down without mercy. He was the enemy, a threat to her people. Yet, she didn't. Because Soraya knew the truth. Beneath the uniform, beneath the war, there was something more. A connection forged in the unlikeliest of places. A hidden moon on the outskirts of the galaxy, where two sworn enemies had once found each other not as soldier and adversary, but as two souls caught in a war not of their making. The memory struck them both at once. A stormy night. A crash landing. A desperate truce between a wounded human pilot and an Arvex warrior with nowhere to go. Their survival had depended on cooperation, but what they found in each other was something deeper. In whispered conversations under a shattered sky, they had shared more than just battle scars. They had shared dreams, fears, the quiet longing for a world without war. But the war had found them again. And now, here they were, on opposite sides once more. Adrian's calm crackled. "Commander, focus. We're losing fighters fast. We need to push forward." He clenched his fists. His duty was to fight, to destroy the Dominion fleet. And yet, in the crosshairs of an Arvex ship, Soraya was waiting. He knew she wouldn't fire, just as she knew he wouldn't either. But the rest of their fleets didn't know. And they didn't care. A missile streaked between them, shaking Adrian's fighter. He saw Soraya's ship spin out of formation, hit but not destroyed. Without thinking, he veered off course, breaking from his squadron and chasing after her as she plummeted toward the wreckage of a derelict dreadnought. "Adrian, what the hell are you doing?" his wingman shouted. He didn't answer. He only knew one thing. He couldn't let her die. Soraya struggled with her controls as alarms screamed in her ears. The impact had knocked out half her systems, and the gravity well of the shattered ship below was pulling her in. She braced for impact, but before she could crash, a shadow loomed over her, a human fighter, matching her descent. "Adrian." A private frequency crackled to life. "Hold on, Soraya." His voice was raw, desperate. "I'm coming for you." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Foolish human," she whispered. But the warmth in her voice betrayed her. The war would not stop for them. The galaxy would not understand. But in this moment, through Fire and Nebulas, their love defied it all. And Adrian Kane would risk everything to prove it. Adrian's ship rumbled as he fought to keep it steady, adjusting to the sudden pull of the gravity well. He activated his thrusters, pushing forward, the stars around him stretching into streaks of light as the speed of the chase increased. Through his calm, he could hear Soraya's voice again, though it was faint, coming through the static. "Adrian, you're wasting time. You can't save me. The ship's too damaged." He refused to listen. He couldn't lose her. Not like this. Not after everything they'd shared in the brief but unforgettable moments on that forgotten moon, where their barriers had fallen and their souls had connected in a way neither could explain. They had spent that night together, not as enemies, but as two beings who simply wanted peace. The morning after, they had parted ways, knowing that the war would continue. Now, years later, their fates were once again bound by the same fire that had driven them apart, the war. But neither had ever stopped thinking of the other. Not for a moment. The dreadnought loomed larger, broken and twisted, its skeletal structure reaching out like a massive, decaying hand. Soraya's ship was spiraling toward it, and Adrian's heart raced as he fought to align his fighter with hers. "Soraya, I'm right here. I can pull you out. Just trust me." She hesitated, just long enough for the stars to swirl in his vision. But then, through the storm of static, he heard her voice again. "Do it, human. Don't let me fall alone." Adrian pushed his controls to the limit, locking his fighter into a dangerous proximity with her crippled vessel. His hands were steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. With one precise maneuver, he deployed a magnetic tether, the cable shooting across space and attaching to Soraya's warship. Got you. Adrian breathed out, his voice tight with relief. Her ship jerked, her controls responding to the magnetic connection. You're mad, you know that. Her voice was a mix of disbelief and admiration. Mad enough to love you, he whispered, his words just for her, though they meant more than anything he had ever said in the midst of war. Without waiting for a response, he began pulling her ship toward his, even as enemy fire continued to crackle around them. The battle raged on, but it felt so far away now. In this moment, nothing else mattered. Not the war. Not the future that was uncertain for both of them. All that mattered was their connection. This moment of calm amidst the chaos. Once he had her close enough, Adrian swung his fighter into position, the magnetic tether still holding fast. Come aboard. I won't let you go. Not now. Not ever. Soraya didn't respond with words, but her ship's hull shifted, aligning with his. Slowly, cautiously, her hatch opened, and with a final, shared look between them, she climbed into his cockpit, her movements slow but purposeful. She was here. They were together again, with no one to tell them that they couldn't be. The battlefield continued to rage behind them, but the two of them were now worlds apart from it. The love they had once shared in secret had found a way to survive the endless war that had torn their worlds apart. No longer enemies, no longer soldiers bound by duty alone. They were just two people, holding on to each other, looking toward a future that neither could predict. Adrian guided them out of the debris field, knowing that their journey would not be easy. The war was still there, the galactic borders still as vast and unreachable as ever. But in his heart, he knew that they had found something worth fighting for, each other. We'll make it through this, he whispered as Soraya rested her head against his shoulder, her eyes soft with exhaustion. Together, Soraya closed her eyes, a small smile tugging at her lips. Yes, she replied softly. Through fire and nebulas, we will. And in the silence that followed, they knew, without a doubt, that love had indeed found a way to transcend the stars. The war would not forgive them. Adrian knew at the moment his fighters' warning alarms shrieked through the cockpit. A trio of human destroyers had broken formation, closing in on his position. Their weapons were locked, their orders clear, no mercy for defectors. Soraya stiffened beside him, her taloned fingers curling instinctively toward her hip where her blade would have been, had she not left it behind in the wreckage of her ship. Her bioluminescent eyes flickered in the dim cockpit light, scanning the radar display. They've seen us, she murmured. Adrian's grip tightened on the controls. I know. The comm crackled. A voice, sharp and commanding. Lieutenant Commander Kane, you are ordered to disengage and surrender immediately. You are aiding an enemy combatant. Stand down or be destroyed. His own people. His own fleet. Soraya's gaze met his, unreadable but intense. You knew this would happen. He did. And still, he had chosen her. Adrian activated his comm. This is Kane. I have an injured pilot aboard. I'm bringing her in for questioning. A pause. Then, a cold response. Negative. She is Arvex. That is a direct violation of war protocols. You have 10 seconds to comply before we open fire. Soraya exhaled softly. They won't let us live, Adrian. He knew that too. Hold on, he said, shoving the throttle forward. His fighter twisted into an evasive maneuver, diving toward the shattered remains of a derelict cruiser below. Laser fire streaked past them, close enough to make the hull rattle. Adrian spun into a corkscrew, ducking into the debris field. The destroyers wouldn't follow him in, not without risking their own shields against the floating wreckage. For now, they had bought seconds. Nothing more. Soraya studied him. You just became a fugitive for me. Adrian let out a breathless chuckle. Yeah, guess I did. Silence filled the cockpit for a moment, aside from the distant hum of the engines. Outside, space was a graveyard of broken ships, the remnants of battles long forgotten. Somewhere in the distance, the war raged on. But here, in this tiny fighter, in this stolen moment, it felt like the universe had narrowed to just the two of them. You didn't have to do this, she whispered. He turned to her. I did. Because if I lost you, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. A flash of emotion crossed her features, one he'd seen before, on that forsaken moon where everything had changed. She reached out, her hand brushing against his. It was a silent promise. one he knew they would have to fight for. The comm crackled again. Lieutenant Kane, this is your last warning. Surrender or be terminated. Adrian exhaled. Guess we need a plan. Soraya smirked, her warrior instincts returning. I have one, but you're not going to like it. He grinned despite the danger. Then it must be a good one. She leaned closer, her voice dropping. We're stealing a warship. Adrian blinked. Then he laughed. Oh, this just keeps getting better. The hunt had begun. The war had made its choice. And now, through Fire and Nebulas, they would carve their own fate, together. Adrian's laughter faded as he glanced at Soraya, her eyes gleaming with that fierce, calculating glint. She had always been a warrior, but this was a different side of her. A side that wasn't defined by her status in the Dominion, but by a shared will to survive. And to be together. Stealing a warship, he muttered under his breath, his voice laced with disbelief. You really are insane. Soraya gave him a knowing smile, her bioluminescent eyes narrowing as she scanned the battlefield around them. Desperate times call for desperate measures. The ship we need is nearby. I've already been studying its movements. We can make it. But first, we need to get out of here. Adrian nodded, gripping the controls with renewed determination. The human destroyers weren't giving up, and the distance between them was closing fast. He knew the consequences if they were caught. Execution for both of them. The betrayal would be irreparable. Lead the way, Adrian said, his tone steady despite the chaos. The last thing he wanted was to put Soraya at risk, but she had already proven that she could handle herself in ways most humans couldn't fathom. Soraya's fingers danced over the display in front of her, tapping in a rapid sequence of commands. The screen in front of Adrian flickered, showing a hidden fleet of Arvex warships scattered throughout the debris field. She was mapping a route, a dangerous one, but it was their only shot. We'll use the wreckage for cover, maneuver around the destroyer's firing range, and board the Dominion flagship. Once we're inside, we can turn its weapons against the fleet. They won't expect that. Adrian's heart raced as he followed her instructions, his fighter weaving through the maze of broken ships and debris. Their path was a tightrope, one miscalculation, and they would be in the crossfire, no more than drifting fragments in the cold void of space. Keep your wits about you, Soraya murmured, her voice almost soft, despite the urgency. We do this, and there's no turning back. Then let's make sure we succeed, Adrian replied. Together, as they neared the edge of the debris field, the hum of enemy engines grew louder, and Adrian could feel the weight of their pursuers pressing in. The three human destroyers had flanked them, their weapons charging. He could almost feel the heat of the lasers through the cockpit as the first volley shot toward them. Brace for impact, Adrian barked. He veered hard to the left, sending his fighter into a violent spin to avoid the incoming fire. Soraya's hands moved instinctively, working in perfect sync with him. She locked her gaze on the Dominion flagship in the distance, a massive warship looming like a fortress in the black void. There, that's our opening, she said, pointing to the side hatch of the flagship. We can board there, while the destroyers are distracted. Adrian's pulse quickened. You're sure? It's now or never. He didn't hesitate. With a flick of the controls, his fighter shot toward the flagship, diving toward the open gap in its defenses. The destroyers fired relentlessly, their lasers barely missing them as they twisted through the space, closing the gap to the enormous vessel. As they neared the flagship, the ship's automated defense system locked onto them, a pulse of energy shooting from the hull, aimed directly at Adrian's fighter. Soraya's voice was urgent. Hold steady, Adrian. The magnetic field's weak near the lower bay. We can use it to land undetected. Adrian nodded, his fingers working furiously to adjust the ship's trajectory. The energy blast grazed his shields, sending a shockwave through the cockpit. He clenched his teeth but pushed through the pain. They were so close now. The magnetic field from the flagship's lower bay activated just as they closed in. With a sharp intake of breath, Adrian activated his ship's docking clamps, feeling the familiar sensation of magnetic pull. The fighter's hull rattled as it latched onto the flagship, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, everything exploded into motion. The docking clamps engaged, and Adrian slammed his fist onto the comm button. We're in, he said, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Soraya turned to him, a fierce smile spreading across her face. Now we take the ship. Together, They disembarked from the fighter, weapons drawn, their bond stronger than ever. As they infiltrated the flagship, they knew this was just the beginning. They had become fugitives, outlaws in the eyes of both the human and Arvex fleets. But together, they were unstoppable. Through Fire and Nebulas, they would carve their own path. No more wars. No more borders. Only the future they would create, forging a destiny beyond the stars. Together. And as they made their way deeper into the heart of the warship, Adrian glanced at Soraya once more. There was no doubt in his mind. This was worth fighting for. Worth dying for. And they would fight, together, until the universe itself bent to their will. The corridors of the Dominion flagship were eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the battlefield outside. Adrian and Soraya moved swiftly through the shadows, their footsteps echoing softly as they navigated the labyrinthine halls. Each step felt like it brought them closer to the heart of the war, but also further away from everything they had ever known. Adrian's mind raced as he glanced at Soraya, her every movement a fluid dance of precision. She was at home in the silence, her instincts sharp and honed by years of war. But he could see the flicker of something else in her eyes, a burning intensity, a shared conviction that they could end this nightmare together. They rounded a corner and stopped. Ahead, a pair of Dominion guards stood watch over a reinforced door. The insignia on their uniforms marked them as elite forces, trained to resist any form of infiltration. But Adrian knew Soraya was more than capable of handling them. She caught his gaze, her lips curling into a smirk. "Leave this to me." Before Adrian could protest, she was already moving. Her steps were silent, her body gliding like a shadow, and in a blur of motion, she reached the guards. The first man didn't even have time to react before she pressed a blade to his throat. The second guard was swiftly disarmed, his weapon dropped to the floor with a soft clink. Soraya's voice was calm, but deadly. "Your lives are in my hands. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The guards, frozen with fear, nodded frantically. She motioned for them to step aside, and without a word, Adrian followed her through the door they had been guarding. Inside, the heart of the warship unfolded before them, a massive control room, bathed in the dim light of countless holographic screens. At the center, a towering figure stood, dressed in the black and gold uniform of the Dominion's highest-ranking officer, Admiral Cale Vorn. Adrian's blood ran cold at the sight of him. Vorn was a legend, ruthless, calculating, and known for his unyielding commitment to the war effort. His reputation had preceded him, and the stories were always the same. No mercy, no hesitation. Soraya stepped forward, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade. "Vorn, your war ends today." The Admiral turned slowly, his cold, blue eyes locking onto hers. A slow smile spread across his face, one that sent a chill down Adrian's spine. "Soraya Vayen," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I should have known you would be the one to betray your own people. But it's too late. You cannot escape the consequences of your actions." Adrian's hand instinctively went to his blaster, but Soraya stayed him with a quick glance. She was in control here. "You're wrong, Vorn," she said, her voice unwavering. "I haven't betrayed anyone. I've chosen the side of those who want peace. And that's the side I'll fight for." Vorn's eyes darkened, and he took a step forward. "You think this is about peace? You're nothing more than a traitor, an outcast. The Dominion will hunt you down, no matter where you go. And you, Kane," he glanced at Adrian with barely concealed disdain. "You're just a soldier, a tool to be discarded when the war is won." Adrian's grip tightened on his weapon, but Soraya's voice stopped him once again. "We're not just soldiers. We're something more. And you're about to find that out the hard way." With a flick of her wrist, the room's lights dimmed, casting long shadows over their adversary. Adrian's heart raced as he saw Soraya's eyes flare with a dangerous intensity. This was her element, the moment she had been preparing for. Without warning, the ship's alarms blared, signaling a breach. Vorn's smile faltered as his gaze darted to the screens. "Impossible," he muttered, but the words were lost in the deafening sound of emergency klaxons. Outside, Adrian knew, their escape was no longer a question of if, it was a matter of when. They had hacked into the warship's core systems, sending out a signal to their allies in the fleet. The Dominion would be blindsided. Vorn turned back to them, his eyes burning with fury. "You're making a grave mistake, Soraya. You'll never escape this. The Dominion's grip is too strong. We'll see about that, Soraya responded, her voice icy. She pulled a data chip from her belt, holding it up for Vorn to see. This chip contains all the intel we need. You'll never be able to stop it. Your fleet will crumble before you. Adrian's heart skipped a beat. She had done it. She had found a way to end the war. Vorn lunged forward, his hand reaching for a weapon at his side, but before he could draw it, Soraya moved. Faster than the eye could track, her blade flashed in a streak of silver, disarming Vorn in a single, fluid motion. He staggered back, shock and rage contorting his face. You dare, he snarled. But his words were cut off as Soraya pressed the point of her blade against his chest. You've lost, Admiral, she said, her voice as cold as space itself. The war is over, and you're the one who started it. Vorn's gaze flickered, and for a moment, Adrian thought he saw something akin to fear in the Admiral's eyes. It was a fleeting expression, but it told him everything he needed to know. They had won. Soraya took a step back, lowering her weapon. Take him to the brig. Let him live long enough to realize what he's lost. Adrian didn't need any more prompting. Together, they seized Vorn and secured him, sending a message to their fleet that would change the course of the war forever. But as they moved to leave the command room, a voice echoed through the comm system. Adrian, Soraya, we've received confirmation. Your signal has reached the Alliance. Reinforcements are on the way. For the first time since this journey began, Adrian felt the weight of the war lifting. They had done it. The end was in sight. Soraya turned to him, a rare softness in her eyes. Together, she whispered. We did this together. And as they stepped into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next, Adrian knew one thing for sure. Their love, born in the heart of a war, would never be extinguished. Through Fire and Nebulas, they had found a way to transcend it all. Together,